Hello, something guys and gals. This is Something Guy 912, or for the sake of this video, County Stake, as a lot of the discussion involving this topic involves my video game namesake. Team Fortress 2 is a game that, despite years of neglect by the developers, a bot infestation the likes of which never seen, and a community growing more apoplectic as their concerns are unheard of, still manages to maintain a very healthy player base that climbs in spite of everything going against it. But that hasn't stopped other people, or businesses, to try to rekindle hope and longevity for a game that has been presumed dead for at least the last 7 years and absolutely fail at the prospect. One such ambitious endeavor was FaceIT, which had launched its own server support for TF2 in March of this year, to the absolute applause of many TFTubers. Solarlight, Big Joey Slapnuts, and Uncle Dane most notably. Such claims about the service included proper auto balance, dedicated server support for a lot, not all, countries, a anti-cheat system that wasn't just an afterthought, and a true casual experience for those not in it to win but to have fun. Now, if all of those things sounded too good to be true for such a giant corporation already wrapped up in controversy before, you'd be damn right to think there's a catch. And boy, were there. To start, the auto balance, or EULA system for posterity, didn't work for jack shit, assuming you hadn't had to download the rootkit for even using the servers to begin with, which in of itself is its own can of worms. It would often pair you up with the same people whom you queued for the prior match. I distinctly remember the majority of my matches either being that I was on a team that was rolling or that I was being rolled, which didn't really curb my enthusiasm all too well, especially when you're on the receiving end of a roll by, you guessed it, another TFTuber. More importantly, said system relied on everyone going for the ready check, which meant if just one person didn't press it, would restart the whole system and drag queues for as long as 30 minutes at a time as a result. Secondly, in order for FaceIT to track potential cheaters with its anti-cheat, some people were required to download an internal rootkit just to use the browser for the service, which suspiciously took a lot of GPU space in order to run. This rootkit would also not be able to distinguish between a genuine cheater and those who were falsely accused, as often people who only played a few matches of Medic, for example, needed to download the rootkit regardless of accusations or false reports being thrown at them. Thirdly, and most infamously, was the claim that FaceIT was the ideal casual experience for TF2. This line already rose eyebrows immediately as soon as you boot up the browser, as there was prize incentives to win matches, bullet spread and random crits, even if I believe those mechanics are annoying in TF2, are removed by default on all servers, a stopwatch system, and a limited map pool that you had to pay a premium just to play more than the 9 randomly chosen maps. But many, and I mean many, of the TFTubers who had hyped this service to oblivion had insisted that either these changes would be unsubstantial to the way that casual TF2 is played, or even claimed that it was a better casual experience despite it feeling like a tacked on matchmaking system similar to the Meet Your Match update. But soon after the tests were in, the writing was on the wall, and FaceIT had quietly changed their tune on their initial service being anywhere close to casual. The majority of these changes to their servers is exactly why matches were so tilted to begin with, because there was actually something on the line for people to win, rather than the desire to just play for fun. So as you would expect, after similar months of negligence by FaceIT to even improve their service to be anywhere broaching a casual experience similar to Valve, most had moved on, and TFTubers to this day, most notably the 3 I mentioned, will try to reinvent history as though they weren't so devoted to making FaceIT work that you'd swear that they were paid by them to do so. But you're not here to talk about how FaceIT TF2 was an awful service that was doomed to fail from the start, because you've likely heard the story all before by a certain YouTuber named Zesty Jesus, which comes into why a lot of the drama surrounding FaceIT TF2 is very much indicative of another then service called Candid. So back in late 2016 and 2017, YouTube and Google at the time were getting very lax in the notion of protecting free speech and wanted to curb would-be offensive people off the web. This didn't bode well for the skeptic community at the time, and needed a new venue to get away from this mentality. Therein comes Candid, a service that had claimed to support free speech in all of its internet anonymity and the like. Most of every single skeptic YouTuber at the time had sung the praises of this service, such that all of them suspiciously sounded the same when they were doing it, and only one YouTuber had the courage to look up if said service was even legitimate, which caused him to be the metaphorical Jesus on the cross for said skeptics' ire: harmful opinions. In researching the nature of this service, he found that Candid was secretly an insidious way to invoke machine learning into catching potentially harmful words, curated by the very same mechanism that said skeptics had praised up and down about. More importantly, during this debacle, the CEO of Candid at the time, Bindu Reddy, was very keen on not only tearing down harmful opinions argument against the service, but using the skeptics that supported it to go after him as well. Because, as it also turned out, many, if not all of the ones who did shill the service, had signed a non-disclosure agreement, meaning they had to not publicly state that their promotion of Candid was a sponsorship. Most notably was TJ Kirk, or the Amazing Atheist, who had in private DMs implicitly stated that Bindu Reddy wanted him to make a video debunking harmful opinions video on the subject. And like with FaceIT's service, eventually Candid had gone down, as Bindu Reddy had taken the information she gathered and ran it to Google to further encroach on free speech. The skeptic's credibility was tarnished after this whole shit show, and harmful opinions found himself the linchpin for merely being the messenger. Now, why do you think I'm drawing this parallel to FaceIT and Zesty Jesus? Well, during FaceIT's initial hype, Zesty was the only one who was willing to be critical about the service that had some amount of pull in the TFTuber landscape. Now, to be fair, he wasn't nearly as elegant about his points regarding the service as harmful opinions was about his.
No one wanted this! Aside from, the 5% of the active player base that constantly calls for a viable competitive system, of which the official version they got crashed and burned, and now no one plays.
But regardless, got a shit ton of flack from all sides of the TFTuber sphere, such that any if all were disregarded, despite a lot of his concerns ending up being fucking true.
Blend casual and competitive together with their casual 12v12 that's actually competitive 12v12, and it just does not work for a game like TF2.
Especially heinous was the way that people like Solarlight and Uncle Dane would use his past actions as indicative of the illegitimacy of his claims regarding FaceIT. That he actively hates the competitive scene and blames the TFTubers who promoted a matchmaking service that got us the Meet Your Match update as proof that he simply doesn't like change regarding FaceIT claiming to be casual. Or when Uncle Dane's Twitter got axed and people assumed that Zesty did so out of malice for him and proceeded to try to get his Twitter axed, to the hurrah of both Solarlight and Jaybird, who virtue signaled about how they supported false flagging a bigot for things he did outside of Twitter. Even as FaceIT TF2 starts to run in the minds of irrelevancy, people still claim that the service died because of what Zesty Jesus said about it, which is giving a lot more credit for someone they supposedly hate. You know who really killed FaceIT? At least for me. It was the fucking TFTubers who simped so hard for this thing that I wouldn't be surprised they too signed a non-disclosure agreement similar to Candid. Especially Solarlight, who was most vocal about trying every which way he could to rationalize any potential issue with Candid, such that he was perfectly fine with the rootkit stealing personal data from your computer because every other corporation does that. A guy who simultaneously can't remember Reddit discussions between my Twitter handle and YouTube handle, but can also assume that a casual TF Reddit user is secretly some other Twitter user who lambasted him, who has infinite skepticism towards the idea that the rootkit could be used maliciously, but immediately believes that FaceIT has their best intentions in mind, who had the absolute gall to tell me that browsers like Marketplace TF weren't being paid by FaceIT to put ad space on their webpage regarding where FaceIT were getting the highly sought after unusuals and cosmetics they were incentivizing players to run their shitty spyware disguised as a browser service for. All of these dismissals and defenses for a service that, by and large, wouldn't benefit from someone sipping for it unless they were paid by them. And while there isn't any evidence for this at the time, I think a lot of them took cues from the skeptics who ran their mouth a little too much and made sure not to step out of line. Of course, why does this all matter? FaceIT already flew too high for its britches and it's now digging its own grave in the process, and most have moved on to normal community servers or multiple requeues for their taste of the experience. I think people need to hold TFTubers accountable for the way they promote and outright advertise the things that they claim they aren't promoting for their own bottom line. Like with Candid, a lot of credibility of those skeptics was lost both because of their inability to be transparent about what they were promoting, as well as the way they had handled dealing with someone who tried to rock the boat. Zesty Jesus shouldn't deserve to be treated this way for being the fucking messenger. Criticize the way he made some of his arguments all you like, but the premise that him simply being critical about something that everyone else is loving is simply an act of maintaining the hive mind. Because FaceIT had all the time and opportunity to take any issues with their service to heart, but if all they're hearing is endless praise from TFTubers paid by them to do so, mediocrity will sink that fucking ship. And if the TFTubers want to insist to me that they weren't being paid by FaceIT to promote their program, well, then I better hear a better argument that wasn't cut from their fucking blog post. Or at least admit they were wrong about anything regarding the service or the tactics they used to shut down the conversation. But as long as we try to reinvent history to make it seem as though people like Solarlight can just write off any wrongdoing he made as optimistic naivete, we'll forever keep shooting the messenger.